In a brightly lit conference room on the 8th floor of a skyscraper, James stood with a spray bottle in one hand and a cloth in the other. The long table was covered in crumbs from the morning meeting, coffee stains, and the faint imprint of a forgotten donut. It was just another day, but James felt a knot tightening in his stomach. This wasn't about the table, it was about something much bigger. James had worked in this corporate setting for over 3 years, but he was not one of the corner office people. He was part of the facilities team, tasked with keeping the building running smoothly. Most days he felt invisible, cleaning up after meetings held by executives who rarely noticed him. They didn't see him as a person, he was just the guy who made the place look good. He kept the rooms tidy and the bathrooms stocked, but that day felt different. As he wiped the table, a soft hum of anxiety buzzed in his mind. The CFO was due to arrive any minute for a meeting with the board. To many, the CFO was a legend, an authority figure, shrouded in success and a bit of mystery. James had heard stories about her sharp tongue and her intense gaze, capable of silencing rooms. He couldn't shake the feeling that today would be pivotal somehow. With each stroke of the cloth, James thought about the weight of every decision made at that table. Those decisions affected people, families, and lives. He wasn't just cleaning up after a meeting, he was preparing a space where futures were shaped. His heart raced. Did they ever stop to think about the role of people like him? Minutes crawled by, each second dripping with tension. Then he heard the elevator doors slide open and footsteps echoed in the hallway. The board members shuffled in, deep in conversation. They were too busy to notice the man standing there, cloth in hand, only focusing on their own agendas. But then she walked in, the CFO, tall and commanding, with an air of confidence that made everyone stand a little taller. Her eyes scanned the room, landing momentarily on James before flicking away as though he were merely a piece of furniture. It stung, but James straightened his back, determined to maintain his dignity. As she sat down at the head of the table, he felt the gravity shift. The room grew quiet and the energy changed. The clatter of laptops being opened seemed like a warning signal. The tension was palpable. They began discussing numbers, projections, risks. Every word felt like a hammer against the rhythm of his heart, but James kept cleaning. He was almost done with the table when he caught snippets of their conversation. Dismissive comments echoed off the walls. The CFO spoke of cutting costs and making hard choices, and James felt a chill run through him. Those hard choices could come for people like him, cleaners, assistants, folks who kept the wheels turning. They didn't know it, but their decisions trickled down to the rest of them. He wrestled with his emotions as he finished cleaning. His hands moved mechanically, but his mind raced. How could they talk about workers as if they were just numbers on a spreadsheet? Didn't they understand the humanity behind those figures? Just then, the CFO raised her voice, cutting through the murmur of the room. "We need to consider the impact of our decisions on every level," she said, her tone firm. James's ears perked up. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for someone to speak for the unsung heroes, the workers, but nobody responded. The finance team hurriedly picked apart the numbers again, unaware of the human cost behind them. James felt the fire inside him simmer. What did those numbers mean for him, for his coworkers? His heart raced more ferociously as he approached the edge of the table. Should he just stay quiet, or was it finally time to make his voice heard? Something inside him stirred, igniting a blend of fear and courage that he never knew existed, and then he made a choice. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling yet unwavering. All heads turned to him, surprise etched on their faces. The CFO's brow lifted slightly, as if intrigued by this unexpected interruption. She asked, her tone curious yet somewhat condescending, I clean this room. I see the aftermath of every meeting," James stammered, his heart pounding. "I see the crumbs, but I also see the people. Every decision made here affects lives, it's not just numbers." Silence enveloped the room as if time had stopped. He wasn't sure if he'd done the right thing. Would they laugh? Would they scorn him? But then he felt a wave of strength surge through him. This wasn't just a job, it was a voice for those who rarely had one. The CFO studied him. For a brief moment, her expression softened. "Go on," she prompted, eyes narrowing. James took a deep breath. "When you talk about cutting costs, you're not just talking about numbers. You're talking about people who work hard, people who have families, people with hopes and dreams." Slight murmur ran through the executives. Some exchanged glances, others seemed to lean in. James felt the pressure mounting, but he didn't back down. If you consider the human side, it can change everything. For a brief moment, the CFO's expression flickered. James could see the gears turning. Had he struck a nerve? Her eyes moved back to the table where papers were strewn, yet a new weight hung in the air. "Thank you for sharing that, James," she said finally, surprising everyone, including herself. "I appreciate your perspective. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers." Her voice, once sharp, now had a note of warmth. James felt an unexpected swell of pride. The room buzzed with reactions, a blend of confusion and curiosity. The CFO stood and paced slightly, her mind racing. "We need to be aware of how our decisions affect everyone," she echoed. James stood back, heart racing. Had he really just changed the conversation? Was it possible that this small act of courage could shift the atmosphere in that room so dramatically? As the CFO went on, discussing a revised approach that would factor in the human cost, he felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Would he document that moment forever in his mind, a turning point? The meeting went on longer than expected, with discussions evolving into consideration for workers' morale and even how numbers could be turned into stories. And during those conversations, James felt seen for the first time, his voice resonating beyond the four walls of that conference room. Even as they wrapped up and the executives filed out, their conversation buzzing about the points James made, one thing was clear: he had stood up when it mattered. He had become more than just the man who cleaned the table. He had become a voice for the unseen. Walking out of the conference room, James felt taller, lighter. The knot in his stomach was still there, but now it held a warmth instead of fear. He had just witnessed something remarkable, how one voice could ripple through a sea of indifference, causing waves of change. As he moved through the halls, he couldn't help but smile. It had started with a cleaning cloth, and now it ended with a spark of hope. James realized that in this vast world, change often started very quietly in spaces few chose to look. Sometimes all it took was someone willing to risk it all, to stand and speak for others. Today he had done just that. He stood alone in the conference room, spray bottle in one hand, a rag in the other. The long, polished table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was an ordinary day for him, but this day had something different about it, electrifying the air around him. It was the kind of tension you could cut with a knife, the kind that came before an important meeting. He had seen it before: executives hustling in, deep in conversation, ready to make decisions that could change lives. Yet today he felt it crawling under his skin, urging him to act. James had been working at this corporate office for 3 years, often overlooked, seldom acknowledged. He was a fixture in the building, but to the people who occupied the high-stakes world in the corner offices, he was invisible, just the guy who cleaned up after their grand ideas. He took pride in his job. After all, it gave him a sense of purpose. But now, as he scrubbed away the remnants of breakfast, he felt an itch of discontent sparking in his chest. The clock ticked and the room slowly filled with the usual players, the CFO, board members, and department heads, all of them wearing suits that seemed as intimidating as their statuses. Conversations buzzed like static in the air, but his heart thundered louder than the chatter. As the CFO, a woman known for her no-nonsense attitude, loomed over the table, James tried to block out the voices, focusing instead on his simple task. With each stroke of his rag, he made the surface shine, but each flicker of movement caught glimpses of their candor, talk of profits, budgets, and trimming excess fat. He was cleaning the very space where plans were laid, decisions made, and lives impacted. Did they understand the people behind those decisions? Did they think about what it meant when they discussed cutting costs? His stomach churned, emotions swirling like a storm inside him. Why was he feeling this way? Was it just about a table? Or was it about something larger? As the chatter grew more animated, punctuated by the CFO's sharp comments, he couldn't ignore it any longer. His feet felt rooted to the floor, but his mind was unshackling. The board members settled into their chairs, laptops clicking open. In that brief moment, he felt as if he were peering into another world, a stark divide between their power and his service. He recalled the stories of friends who had been let go, people he worked alongside who lived paycheck to paycheck. Their livelihoods had vanished with a single meeting like this. "Let's cut to the chase," the CFO said, her voice slicing through the murmurs. "We all know we need to save money." James froze. The air shifted, thickening with a tension that bore down on him. Saving money often meant prioritizing the bottom line over the people who carried the company on their backs. Did they realize that laying off workers wasn't merely a number, a statistic on a sheet? He wanted to scream, to leap forward and demand they see beyond the spreadsheets. So there he was, rag in hand, standing by the conference table, suddenly caught in a whirlwind of emotion. What if he spoke? Would anyone listen? A wave of determination washed over him, and he felt his heart racing, his palms clammy against the cloth. Just before he could second-guess himself, he inhaled deeply, stepping out from the shadows. His voice echoed off the walls, startling the room into silence. All heads turned, and the CFO's eyes narrowed, clearly taken aback by this interruption. She asked, her tone half annoyed, half curious, as if she were sizing him up. James blinked rapidly, but a newfound strength surged within him. I clean this table." He took a breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I see everyone who comes in here. I clean up after meetings, and I hear the conversations. When you talk about cutting costs, it's more than just numbers to a lot of us. It means families, it means realities." The room fell into a heavy stillness, uninvited thoughts flickering on their faces, but his heart beat louder, drowning out any fears. "I'm not just a cleaner, I'm part of this team. We're all connected, and those decisions affect us all." For the first time, James locked eyes with the CFO, who now seemed caught off guard. Her expression flickered, revealing a moment of vulnerability. Was it surprise, understanding? For James, that frozen second felt like a monumental shift. The CFO hesitated, glancing around the room at her colleagues, who seemed equally astonished. "Well, that's an interesting perspective," she replied slowly, her tone shifting. A board member quipped, translating the tension into curiosity. James pressed on, leaning into the moment. I know you're here to do what's best for the company, but remember the people behind those decisions. They have families, dreams, struggles. It's not as simple as losing a line on a budget sheet. He felt a rush of adrenaline, emboldened by honesty. The CFO's eyes searched his face, reflecting something he dared to hope for. You're right, she said, the words tumbling out as if drawn from somewhere deep inside her. Slowly, murmurs of agreement began to envelop the table. A silence lingered, pregnant with the significance of what had just transpired. It was clear this wasn't just a conversation about financial strategies anymore. James felt a shift among those seated around him, a crack in the usual rigidity. They hadn't considered the human element before, buried in numbers and projections. Maybe this was a turning point. The CFO stood, her presence commanding yet less formidable than before. Let's take a step back and reevaluate what we really value, she said, speaking to the group. If we're going to thrive, we must also take care of our people. With each word, the atmosphere changed. Discussions turned not just to cuts, but to ways to foster employee morale, building a community rather than just a workforce. They discussed mental health initiatives, job security, and a more inclusive company culture. As James listened, a wave of realization washed over him. He wasn't just a cleaner anymore, he was an advocate, a voice that sparked reflection among decision makers. Here he was, standing at a conference table, feeling weightless in the moments of dialogue unfolding around him. Time slipped by, but he didn't care. Hours could have passed, but in that room, conversations shifted from profit margins to pondering the humanity within the machinery of business. They discussed workshops, training opportunities, and recognizing employees not just as numbers, but as integral members of the team. The board meeting stretched on, and James felt grounded as he engaged in the discussions, slipping his own experiences into the mix. He belonged here more than he ever thought he could, and for once he felt his work mattered beyond the confines of mops and spray bottles. Finally, it was over. The conference members shook hands and began to leave, their energy lighter, the tension having dissolved into a shared purpose. As they filed out, the CFO paused at the door, looking back at him. Thank you for your courage today, she said. That simple acknowledgement sent shivers down his spine. In a flash, James understood the profound reality. Change could start anywhere, even from the most unexpected corners. He cleaned not just tables, but souls and perspectives. After they left, silence draped the room. James lingered, alone once again, but it felt different now, full of possibility. He gathered his cleaning supplies, heart still racing with disbelief and empowerment. Today was unlike any other. Standing at the polished table, reflecting on everything that had transpired, he realized the essence of what he had done. He had spoken for the unseen. He had transformed discomfort into dialogue. He had altered the course of a corporate behemoth with nothing but a few bold words and a conscious heart. As he walked out of the conference room, he carried the weight of newfound purpose, a growing conviction that every role mattered. He could still play his part, a vital thread woven into the large tapestry of the company's journey. And little did they know, behind the scenes, a single voice had risen from the shadows, transforming fear into courage and silence into profound impact. James left the building with a smile, heart full. And a reality dawned on him. It didn't take a boardroom title to make a difference. It merely took a willingness to stand up and speak the truth. And sometimes the people you least expect can spark the change that echoes beyond any conference room. The air was thick with anticipation as the door swung open, revealing an array of sleek suits and polished shoes entering the conference room. James, the facilities manager, stood in the corner, spray bottle in one hand and a rag in the other. He watched as the CFO strode in, commanding attention with an aura of authority that made even the most hardened of board members straighten their backs. But James was just the guy who cleaned. He had spent 3 years in this building, wiping away crumbs and coffee stains while the execs pulled the strings that moved the company forward. To them, he was invisible, a ghost in the background of their corporate play. But today, something felt different. A storm was brewing inside him, a tidal wave of suppressed emotions that yearned for release. He focused on the conference table, scrubbing away remnants of breakfast as he replayed the tension from countless meetings, the decisions that shaped lives without a glance in his direction. Some of his closest friends had been let go in budget cuts that were decided right here. The chatter of numbers and projections echoed in his ears as he watched the board members take their seats. They snapped open their laptops, fingers dancing over keyboards, while he remained in the shadows, just another part of the furniture. As the CFO took her place at the head of the table, the room fell silent, the executive air thickening with unspoken agendas. "Let's get to it," she began, her voice sharp like a knife slicing through the stillness. His heart raced at the words. Cutting costs meant real people, real lives torn apart. Did they even consider who would be affected? He thought of the cleaning staff, the security team, the people who lifted this company every single day. They were always out of sight, always overlooked. A wave of anger surged through him. As they continued their discussions about the numbers, James clenched his jaw, the urge to be heard growing stronger by the second. He had not asked to be part of these conversations, but his heart ached for those who had no voice. What harm could come from speaking up? He wrestled with the thought, weighing his fear against the burning desire for change. And then, as if an invisible force pushed him forward, he stepped out from the shadows. "Excuse me," he said, his voice breaking the tension like a thunderclap. All heads turned, surprise rippling through the group. The CFO's sharp eyes narrowed, a mixture of irritation and curiosity washing over her face. She asked, almost dismissively. James felt a rush of courage. "I clean this room. I see how the decisions made here affect others. I hear the number crunching and forecasts, but I also know the human cost behind those decisions. Cutting costs isn't just numbers on a sheet." Silence fell like a heavy blanket. The executives exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond to this unexpected interruption. But in that moment, James felt a connection and understanding that rippled through his body as realization dawned. This wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who felt invisible. "I clean up after meetings like this, and I hear you talking about reducing staff, cutting benefits, and trimming down on resources," he continued, yearning for them to understand. "But those cuts have faces. They have families." The CFO looked at him, her face a mask of contemplation. "Your point is valid," she admitted slowly, her sharp tone softening. "But this is a business. Pressure is one thing," James countered, his voice steady now. "But losing good people, that's not just business, that's tearing apart a community, and community matters." The CFO raised an eyebrow as if weighing his words against the churning chaos of her mind. The air was thick with anticipation, but James felt lighter. As he spoke, he could see some board members nodding ever so slightly, just a flicker of recognition, but it was enough to spur him onward. "People here work hard," he said, leaning in, his hands clenched around the rag. "They dedicate their lives to this job, and it's easy to forget that in a room full of numbers." In that moment, the room shifted. The CFO's eyes narrowed with contemplation, and the buzz of whispers from the board members began to swirl. "You're right," she finally said, her voice gaining strength. James felt a swell of hope rise within him. "It's not just about employment, it's about morale, trust, and respect. If we cut too deeply, we risk breaking the spirit of this organization." The CFO glanced down at her notes, deep in thought. It was as if each word James had spoken had stripped away the layers of corporate indifference, exposing the raw feelings beneath. For the first time, they began to consider the implications of their choices, not just for the bottom line, but for everyone involved. The chatter around the table picked up again, but now it had shifted. Instead of dry discussions of profit margins and expenditure cuts, they began tossing around ideas, brainstorming new ways to promote employee wellness and retention. Someone suggested a mentorship program, another added a proposal for town hall meetings to foster open dialogue. The more they spoke, the more James felt a real change brewing in the air. His heart pounded as he absorbed the transformation happening right in front of him. The room now pulsed with energy and innovation, a stark contrast from the sterile atmosphere just moments before. "Let's develop initiatives that recognize hard work. People need to feel valued," one executive proposed, enthusiasm building. "We can allocate resources for professional development," another suggested. As they traded ideas, James realized the wave of change was moving beyond the conference table. They were finally acknowledging the human element behind their decisions, and it felt like a breakthrough. The burden had lifted. Workers were no longer mere statistics, they were partners in this business journey. The CFO, visibly energized by the heated discussion, turned to James with a newfound respect. "You've opened our eyes today, and we need more voices like yours." She gestured to the others, encouraging input from around the table, allowing the conversation to flow freely. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Every word had brought them closer to understanding the community they were part of, a community he had been defending for so long. As the meeting neared its end, the buzz in the room continued, spirits rising with shared ideas and vision. For the first time since James started working there, he felt a genuine bond forming, a thread connecting him to the executives, an understanding that they could all lift each other. When the last ideas were presented and the meeting was called to a close, the CFO stood up, taking a moment to catch everyone's attention again. "Before we wrap up, I'd like to thank James for his courage today. The decisions made here today will not only shape the company's future, but also strengthen our community." James's heart swelled as applause filled the room. He didn't just clean the table that day, he had made a difference. The feeling was surreal, radiating through him as if he'd finally found a vital piece of himself he thought was lost. One by one, executives filed out of the room, shaking James's hand and thanking him for his input. As the last person left, the air felt lighter, their energy vibrant with promise. He stood alone in the conference room, finally feeling the impact of his courage manifesting around him. He began to clean the table once more, but this time it felt lighter, almost like polishing a piece of art instead of just clearing debris. With every wipe, he reflected on the conversations that had unfolded, the shifts that had taken place. Deep down, James knew this wasn't just the end of a meeting. It was the beginning of something new, a narrative about respect and empowerment, a commitment to foster a workplace where every voice mattered. As he finished up, he took a moment to look around the bright, airy space, a sleeping giant of possibilities. Today, he wasn't just cleaning up after a meeting, he had sparked a change. Each stroke of the rag felt like a promise. Every tiny mark he cleared represented a step toward a better world within the walls of that corporation. Tomorrow, he would come back, ready to continue the work he was proud of. And he would do it knowing that he belonged, no longer just a cleaner, but an integral part of a team aiming for something bigger. He cleaned the conference table, yes, but what he truly polished was a shared vision, one that would echo far beyond the conference room walls. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the conference room floor. James stood by the massive, polished table, its surface reflecting the light like a mirror. With a spray bottle in one hand and a cloth in the other, he scrubbed away at the remnants of yesterday's lunch crumbs, coffee stains, and unwanted fingerprints. He had done this countless times, but today something felt different. An electric tension coursed through the air. Outside the glass walls, the hustle and bustle of the corporate world hummed softly. Executives in tailored suits moved about with purpose. Among them was the CFO, a woman known for her laser focus and no-nonsense demeanor. She was always in control, playing the game of numbers and strategies like a chess master. Today's meeting was critical. They would be discussing budget cuts that could shake the foundation of the company. James wiped the table in a rhythmic motion, his mind wandering as he listened to the muffled sound of excited chatter outside the room. In the corners of his thoughts, anger brewed at the idea of cuts that would likely affect people like him. Cleaned the floors, stocked the bathrooms, and made sure the office was welcoming. But to the executives, he was just invisible, faded into the background of their corporate lives. With each stroke of the cloth, his frustration grew. Did they even think about the humans behind the numbers? Their discussions about cost efficiency and streamlining operations churned in his mind like a storm. Those were not just phrases, they were lives at stake, families who depended on their jobs to put food on the table. As he finished his task, the board members began to file into the room. The murmur of conversations merged with the sound of laptops opening and pens scratching against paper. James glanced at the digital clock on the wall. Minutes away from the meeting, he felt the nervous energy rise in his chest like a bubbling pot ready to overflow. The CFO entered last, her presence radiating authority. She surveyed the room and settled at the head of the table, her gaze sharp as she connected with each person in the room. It was time for business, and James felt like an outsider, a silent witness to a world that rarely acknowledged him. "Let's cut to the chase," the CFO said, her voice slicing through the tense atmosphere. Everyone snapped to attention. "We need to identify areas where we can make cuts immediately." A knot tightened in James's stomach. Cutting costs often led to layoffs, a grim reality he had witnessed before. He thought of his friend Sarah, who had been let go last year, a bright, hardworking woman who had given her all to the company. Decisions made here in this very room had stripped away her livelihood. The meeting commenced, discussions of budgets and projections making a cacophony of numbers that drowned out humanity. James felt suffocated by the reality, a cold, unyielding machine that didn't stop to consider the lives behind the data points. Watching them, he felt a surge of defiance rise within him, a desperate urge to break free from his invisibility. But what could he do? What could a cleaner say that would matter in the grand scheme of their world? He wrestled with the fear that gripped him, yet the burning desire to speak up clawed its way to the surface. A voice in his head roared, urging him to stop hiding. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the table, overcoming the invisible wall that had kept him quiet for far too long. "Excuse me," he said, his tone surprising even himself. The room fell silent, all eyes trained on him, a ripple of confusion washing over the board members' expressions. The CFO tilted her head, taking in this unexpected interruption. She asked, a hint of irritation in her voice. Gathering his courage, James pressed on, his heart pounding. "I cleaned this room. While you discuss numbers that affect the company's bottom line, I want you to remember the people who work here." A stunned silence enveloped the room, and for a brief moment it felt like time had stopped. Executives exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. James could feel his pulse racing, but within that intensity lay a sense of conviction he had never experienced before. "Might see budgets on a screen," he continued, words tumbling out with urgency, "but those budgets come with sacrifices. I've seen good people lose their jobs because of decisions made without considering the human impact." The CFO's eyebrows furrowed, her gaze never leaving his face. For the first time, James saw a flicker of something deeper. Was it concern, recognition? He pressed on, pouring out his heart. "Every day when I clean this table, I think about how those discussions shape our lives." As he spoke, James watched the room transform. The initially perplexed expressions shifted to contemplation, and the CFO leaned back in her chair, visibly processing his words. Could he have touched a nerve? "James," she said cautiously, her voice steadier now, "I appreciate your courage to speak up. It's easy to forget the human side in the corporate world." An unexpected energy coursed through the room, an acknowledgement of the need to bridge the gap between decisions and their effects. The executives began to engage in a dialogue that extended beyond their standard fare of financial metrics. Ideas began to swirl, conversations igniting like matches striking against kindling. One board member suggested tentatively, and suddenly James found himself becoming part of the conversation, contributing not just as an observer but as a vital voice. He shared thoughts on how employee engagement could improve performance and how people's well-being directly influenced company morale. His ideas flowed freely, resonating with the emerging sense of unity in the room. Discussions evolved from numbers to people, how to promote professional growth, incentivize loyalty, and develop a culture of transparency where everyone felt heard. For the first time, James felt the barriers fade, the divide between his world and theirs narrowing. As the meeting carried on, the energy shifted from anxiety to hopefulness. The executives began to rally around the idea of investing in their employees rather than cutting them down. They spoke about developing programs that would empower their workforce, emphasizing that a strong company is built on strong foundations, a workforce that feels valued and secure. The CFO, visibly energized by the conversation, reflected on their previous decisions. In that moment, James felt a rush of validation. This was what he had longed for, an acknowledgement that every role mattered and every voice could spur change. Here he was, the cleaner, standing shoulder to shoulder with decision makers, making ripples in a vast ocean of corporate indifference. When the meeting came to a close, the CFO stood up, her demeanor transformed. "I want to thank James for his insight today," she declared. "His words will guide our path forward." Applause broke out, and he felt that intoxicating wave of recognition wash over him, his heart soaring. James realized he had accomplished something profound. He had walked into that room invisible, but emerged as a catalyst for change. As the executives filed out, many of them offered words of thanks, shaking his hand appreciatively. Their gestures reflected a newfound respect as they recognized not just him, but the invaluable role of every individual in the organization. When the last executive left, James stood in the conference room, a sense of disbelief washing over him. This wasn't just about cleaning tables anymore, it was about washing away the barriers that separated people. He took a moment to soak in the lightness of the room, the vibrant energy still hanging in the air. He returned to the table, this time wiping it down with purpose. It felt like a canvas washed clean to make room for new ideas and new relationships. With every stroke, he reflected on how today had transformed him. He had discovered his own voice and embraced the power that came with it. As he finished and looked out through the glass walls, he saw the bustling world outside, a world where he had once felt like a mere shadow. Today, however, was a testament to the voice within. It proved that even the unseen could rise to inspire change. With that thought, James walked out of the conference room, the weight of responsibility mingling with the joy of empowerment. He was no longer just the man who cleaned, he was part of a movement. And as he prepared for the next day, he felt eager and hopeful, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. Each of his days from here on out held promise, the kind birthed from a simple act of courage. James had found his place, and in doing so had transformed the landscape of the company he had worked for all along. With every word he had spoken and every idea shared, he had sparked a revolution, not just in the boardroom, but in the hearts of everyone who walked through those doors. The conference room was pristine, the air still, hanging heavy with unspoken words. James stood at the far end, spray bottle in hand, wiping down the enormous glass table that reflected the stark fluorescent lights above. He scrubbed away yesterday's crumbs and coffee rings, his heart racing. Today, the CFO was going to present a plan that could change everything, or, as James feared, take things from bad to worse. He had cleaned this table countless times, his hands gliding across its surface, yet today felt different. Today there were murmurs of budget cuts and layoffs buzzing in the office like a dark cloud looming overhead. The streets outside were bustling with life, but in here a quiet tension held everyone captive. As he wiped the table, he couldn't shake the anxiety that festered inside him. He thought about the employees who were more than just names on a spreadsheet. People like Sarah, a single mom who worked late to support her kids. Or Tom, the new intern who had barely settled in. The idea of cutting jobs haunted him. He couldn't let it happen without saying something. The door swung open and the board members began to trickle in, greets and nods exchanged like visual handshakes. Their crisp suits and polished shoes were a stark contrast to James's uniform. He saw them as a kind of elite, detached from the everyday lives of the staff below. As the last one entered the CFO, all power and presence, the air shifted. She took her seat at the head of the table, her gaze scanning the room. People quieted, laptops prepared, and pens poised. There was no escaping the gravity of the meeting. "Let's get straight to the point," the CFO said, her voice slicing through the silence. James's heart sank as the numbers began to fly through the air like bullets, cuts to marketing, reductions in services, and worst of all, the looming possibility of layoffs. Each word felt like a punch to his gut. He felt invisible, a mere ghost watching as they dissected the lives of people he deeply cared about. In that moment, something in him snapped. I can't stay silent anymore, he thought. He dropped the cloth, taking a deep breath, his heart pounding like a drum. He had to speak up. This was no longer just about cleaning. It was about lives, real lives on the line. Gathering his courage, he stepped closer to the table, surprising even himself. "Excuse me," he said, his voice breaking the tension. Heads turned and the stiff atmosphere shifted under his unexpected intrusion. The CFO arched an eyebrow. She asked, her tone cool yet curious. "I cleaned this room," James began, his voice steadying. "And while you discuss budgets and cuts, I want you to remember that those cuts have real impacts on real people." Silence enveloped the room. The board members exchanged looks, surprise and confusion etched on their faces. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he pressed on. These aren't just lines on a financial report, they're friends and colleagues. The CFO's eyes narrowed, her expression changing as if searching for the right response. He could see the realization flicker across her face. For a brief moment, the lavish conference room felt small. The walls seemed to close in around them. "James, I appreciate your perspective," the CFO said slowly, causing a shift in the atmosphere. His voice rose, surprising even himself as he felt the words pour out, filled with an urgency he had never before unleashed. "If you cut jobs, morale will plummet." Witnessing the room's reaction, James felt emboldened. He was no longer just a cleaner, he was a voice rising against apathy. He saw heads nodding slightly, executives starting to exchange glances that spoke of realization. "Shareholder value may be the goal," he continued, "but without the people who drive that value, there's nothing left to share." The CFO glanced around the table, her stern demeanor cracking just a fraction. "We've been so caught up in the numbers," she admitted, an honesty creeping into her voice. "It's easy to forget the human element." James pressed on, the courage exploding within him. "In this very room, you can change the company's direction. You can choose to invest in the people who actually keep this ship afloat." The tension shifted once more. The CFO placed her hands on the table, the weight of her status beginning to hum with responsibility. She asked, her tone softer now, almost seeking collaboration. The room erupted with murmurs, executives pulled into a genuine discussion. James could hardly believe what was happening. He offered ideas that had been swirling in his mind: mentorship programs, employee recognition, open forums for communication, and team-building exercises. He spoke passionately, watching the executives jot down notes, their posture shifting from defensive to engaged. As they brainstormed solutions, James transformed from an invisible cleaner to a vital contributor. Ideas flowed, and the room began to hum with possibilities. They spoke of retaining talent, building teamwork, and creating a culture of trust. It was magical, a coalition forming in real time, unveiling a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of their roles. The CFO leaned in, a spark of inspiration lighting her eyes. "We can host regular feedback sessions, make employees feel seen and heard." James felt an exhilarating rush of hope as he saw the tides turn, the executives around him seemingly awakened to the purpose of their work, the people. Conversations pivoted from mere survival to brilliant ideas that lifted spirits and proposed growth. Someone suggested, another exclaimed, a warmth blossomed in James's chest. Here in this moment, he was part of something significant, something that could alter the fate of their workplace. Together, they were building a narrative rooted in empathy and understanding. At the end of the meeting, after minutes that felt like hours had passed, the CFO stood and looked around the table, her expression softening further. "I want to express my deepest gratitude to James for bringing this conversation to light," she said, her tone genuine. Applause erupted, and James stood in shock, the warmth of recognition washing over him. In an office that had once felt sharp and cold, he had sparked change, no longer just a cleaner but an advocate for everyone. As the other members filed out, they took turns thanking him, their voices filled with sincerity. Each handshake felt like a thread weaving him into the fabric of a community he had previously felt detached from. When the last of them disappeared, James lingered in the conference room, now glowing with the promise of new beginnings. Even the shadows felt lighter somehow, and the air buzzed with a thrilling energy. He finished wiping the table, but stopped to truly look at it for the first time. This place was more than just a workplace. It was a hub of dreams, aspirations, and interconnected lives. His hands had just transformed it from a place of cold decisions to a space where empathy could thrive. Stepping back, James thought about the power of a single voice. In a world that often forgot about the invisible, he had found a way to be heard. Today, he had turned vulnerability into strength, and in doing so, had built bridges where walls once stood. As he left the room, he carried a renewed sense of purpose, a realization that the work he did mattered in profound ways. And as the sun set outside, casting warm hues across the sky, he knew that tomorrow would come with new challenges, but he was ready. He was no longer just a cleaner. He was a vital part of a bigger vision, one that would help everyone rise together, united and stronger. That conference room with its polished table was the stage where James had emerged, where his story intertwined with those of his colleagues. He felt empowered, poised to step forward, ready for the next meeting, the next conversation, knowing he had the courage to make a difference one act of bravery at a time. The clock ticked ominously, counting down the minutes until the meeting began. The conference room was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chatter of the bustling office just beyond the glass walls. James stood at one end of the massive table, spray bottle in one hand, cloth in the other, scrubbing away the remnants of yesterday's lunch. The faint smell of coffee still lingered, but all he could feel was the weight of anxiety pressing down on him. He had cleaned this table many times, each swipe of the cloth a mundane part of his job, but today was different. Today, the CFO was coming in to discuss budget cuts that could spell disaster for everyone in the company. Friends, coworkers, families, people whose lives would drastically change based on decisions made in this room. As he wiped away the last stubborn coffee stain, a surge of frustration bubbled up. Did they even realize the consequences of their decisions? James thought of Sarah, a single mother working late shifts to support her kids, and Tom, the eager intern who had barely settled in. They were not just numbers on a balance sheet. They had lives, hopes, dreams, and responsibilities. The door swung open and the first board member walked in, nose buried in a tablet, oblivious to James as he walked past. More executives followed, their eyes fixated on their devices, immersed in conversations that floated over James's head, conversations filled with jargon and numbers that seemed to drown out humanity. He felt his heart race, the pounding echoing in his ears. Then she walked in, the CFO. She was tall, with a sharp suit that made her appear even more formidable. James watched as she cast a glance around the room, her gaze pausing on him for just a moment, a flicker of recognition that barely registered. She sat at the head of the table and the atmosphere shifted, a heaviness settling as everyone adjusted their posture, preparing for what was to come. "Let's get straight to business," she said, her voice commanding as she glanced at her notes. "We all know why we're here. We need to cut costs." With every word she spoke, the anxiety that had been bubbling inside James began to overflow. He couldn't hold back anymore. The words tumbled in his mind, desperate to escape. As budget numbers flew around the room like arrows, he felt the tension rise even higher. His breath quickened, and with a sudden impulse, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he managed to say, his voice shaky but firm. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, disbelief hanging in the air. The CFO raised an eyebrow, her expression ranging from surprise to irritation. She asked, clearly annoyed by the interruption. His resolve solidified. "I cleaned this table, and while you discuss numbers that could affect so many lives, I just want you to remember that those cuts have consequences." Silence enveloped the room. He could feel their stares, a mix of intrigue and uncertainty, but something shifted within him. Fear that had gripped him started to fade as the urgency of the moment took over. When you talk about cutting jobs or reducing resources, you're not just discussing profit margins. He saw a flicker in the CFO's eyes, maybe understanding, maybe concern. He pressed on. "People like Sarah and Tom, they fill this place with energy, with ideas to keep the company alive. If you cut them, you're cutting more than just expenses." The CFO shifted in her seat, the weight of his words beginning to resonate. The board members exchanged glances, their earlier defensive postures softening. "James," she finally said, her voice softer, "you make a valid point. I understand that," James replied, feeling emboldened. "But surviving shouldn't come at the cost of losing good people." The room buzzed with uncertainty. James felt his heart race harder as he continued. "We need to invest in the people who drive this business. A workforce that feels valued produces better results." The CFO regarded him thoughtfully. "Exactly, let's think of creative solutions," he implored, feeling the momentum shift toward him. "Invest in training programs, offer incentives for employees who innovate within their roles. It can foster loyalty." And before he could finish, the CFO interrupted, a spark igniting in her eyes. "You're right." Voices started rising around the table. One board member suggested. Another chimed in. James felt invigorated. Ideas bubbled and swirled, each one adding more fuel to the fire. They could brainstorm solutions that included everyone. Instead of just discussing cuts, the focus shifted to fostering growth and maintaining a supportive environment. The CFO leaned forward, her demeanor altering completely. James's heart swelled with hope. This room, which had felt so imposing, now buzzed with collective energy. Their lives were intertwining in a conversation that had the potential to alter the course of their company forever. As they worked through potential solutions, laughter and enthusiasm began to fill the air. Ideas flowed freely, and the discussions morphed into plans that prioritized not just profit, but the people behind it. The meeting stretched on, but the atmosphere transformed from tense to dynamic. It felt electric, every person leaning in, eager to contribute, eager to build the community stronger than before. James couldn't believe how quickly it had happened. A moment at a table that seemed so ordinary had spiraled into something extraordinary. When the meeting finally wrapped up, the CFO stood, looking around at the group with a new sense of rejuvenation. "Thank you, everyone. Today we began to understand how vital our team is to our success." She paused, her gaze locking onto his. Applause erupted in the room, and James felt his cheeks flush. He was just a cleaner, but today he had stood up and been heard. The room was alive with possibilities, and the energy shifted from fear to excitement. As they filed out, board members approached him, thanking him for his courage. Each handshake felt more substantial than the last, a confirmation that he had connected with them in a way he had never dared to dream. They were no longer the suits who walked by him without a glance, they were allies. When the last executive left, James stood alone in the conference room, the once stalwart walls feeling more inviting. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding, the tension draining away. This wasn't just about cleaning anymore, it represented something bigger. As he began to wipe down the table again, this time he noticed how clean it looked, a surface ready to be filled with fresh ideas and collaboration. It no longer felt like just a place for cold discussions of budgets and cuts. It was a space where change could happen. James understood that he had taken a leap today. One voice, even from a guy with a mop and a bucket, could create ripples in an ocean of indifference. He couldn't return to cleaning simply to stay unnoticed, not after seeing the result of stepping forward. He felt alive with purpose, knowing that he had sparked a change that could lead to a new era for his company, a culture where people mattered just as much as profits. As he exited the room, he looked back at the conference table, a palpable symbol of transition, of hope. As his footsteps echoed down the hallway, James knew his role had transformed. He was no longer just a cleaner, he was a catalyst for change, an advocate for the voices that often went unheard. Tomorrow would come with new challenges, but he was ready. With each step, he felt lighter, empowered, and determined. From that day forward, he would carry the understanding that every action could lead to something greater, every voice mattered, even the quiet ones, and he had become unafraid to let his be heard. And so the journey began, not just for James, but for everyone in that office, a renewed commitment to building a culture rooted in empathy, connection, and respect. A legacy born from a simple cleaning cloth and a courageous heart. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the sound echoing softly as James wiped the conference table for what felt like the 100th time. The room sparkled under the fluorescent lights, pristine and intimidating. Outside, the office hummed with the energy of people bustling about their day, but inside this room, a tension was building. It was palpable, almost like a living entity. The door swung open and the CFO strode in with an air of authority. Her presence filled the room. James straightened up, gripping the cloth tightly, the scent of cleaning supplies mingling with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. This meeting was crucial. Executives gathered not just to discuss numbers, but to make decisions that could alter lives. As the board rushed in, their faces were shadowed by laptops and tablets, their brows furrowed in concentration. James saw them as they scurried by, each engrossed in their own world as if he were nothing more than the furniture. A wave of frustration swept over him. These were the very people whose decisions could mean the difference between a job and unemployment for hardworking folks like Sarah and Tom. All their efforts might be swept away with a simple meeting. "Let's get started," the CFO said, her voice cutting through the chaos. As she looked down at her document, James felt a lump in his throat. The stakes were higher than ever. Today was about budget cuts, a topic that made his stomach churn. The numbers began to fly around the room. "We need to save 10%, one executive suggested. "Reducing staff is one option," another added, and every word felt like a knife piercing through the air. The board members nodded, most taking notes, eyes glazed over as they discussed cuts without fully grasping their gravity. James clenched his hands around the cloth, his heart racing. He thought of all the lives entwined in this sophisticated dance of numbers. It wasn't just data, it was people living paycheck to paycheck, families depending on them. The frantic energy of the meeting sparked an urgency inside him. Something needed to be said. He took a deep breath, summoning the courage that felt elusive in that moment. He blurted out, the words erupting from his lips like a thunderclap, surprising even himself. All heads turned, the room slipping into a stunned silence. The CFO lifted an eyebrow, her cool demeanor unwavering. She asked, her voice both curious and annoyed, clearly surprised but unwilling to show weakness. James stepped forward, adrenaline surging through him. "I clean this conference room every day. I see what happens in here and I hear what you all talk about." A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. The CFO exchanged glances with her colleagues, uncertainty flickering across her face. She didn't expect to be interrupted, not today, not in this crucial meeting. "Cutting staff isn't just about numbers, it's about real people," James continued, feeling his voice grow steadier. The CFO's expression shifted just slightly, as if a crack had been made in her armor. He could see her considering what he was saying, and his confidence surged. "If you lay off workers, people will lose their incomes, but they will also lose their sense of purpose." The board members exchanged glances, the tension thickening. James's voice rang out, steady and strong. "In this room, you hold the power to shape more than just the company's finances. You can choose to uplift your people instead of bringing them down." The CFO looked at him, her brow furrowing. She asked, her voice carrying a hint of skepticism but also curiosity. "Investing in training programs, enhancing our workplace culture," he began passionately, buoyed by the connection he felt with every executive. These are real ways to improve productivity and loyalty without tearing lives apart. Create mentorship opportunities, establish feedback systems where employees feel valued. It's not just about saving money. As he spoke, he felt a ripple of energy moving through the room. Executives leaned forward, their initial skepticism melting into interest. The CFO, who had once seemed immovable, began to soften. "You're saying we should focus on retention rather than cuts?" "Yes," he replied, exhilaration filling him. "Think about how much more effective a motivated team can be. People need to feel like they matter. When they do, they'll go above and beyond." James could see the cogs in their minds turning, their brows furrowing in contemplation. The atmosphere began to shift, words of agreement murmured throughout the table. "I think we've gotten too caught up in immediate pressures," one board member admitted. "Yes, a culture of appreciation could boost morale," another chimed in. The discussion transformed, the mood lightening. Ideas bounced around like a basketball in a game, flowing more freely. They were no longer shackled by fear or numbers. They were becoming partners in shaping the company's future. The CFO's demeanor changed entirely. "We're in this together," she said, a determined glint in her eyes. The waves of conversation grew broader as they began to brainstorm actionable steps. They spoke about workshops, team-building exercises, and even company-sponsored events to strengthen connections among employees. The once sterile atmosphere transformed into one of hope, anticipation lighting up every face around the table. James felt a swell of pride in his chest. His heart raced at the realization that he had helped ignite a spark. He was no longer just the invisible cleaner. He had risen to be an integral part of this dynamic conversation. The weight of his voice resonated deeply. As discussions continued, the CFO motioned for everyone to settle down, her voice now firm and passionate. "Let's commit to putting this into action. Our employees are our most valuable asset." Applause erupted around the room, and James's breath caught in his throat. He glanced down at the conference table, now buzzing with possibility, the polished surface reflecting the enthusiasm in every face. He felt a rush of emotions, disbelief mingling with joy. Today, a cleaner had changed the course of a company. It was surreal, exhilarating, and overwhelmingly validating. Once the meeting concluded, board members approached him one by one, each offering words of gratitude. Their eyes sparkled with renewed energy. "Thank you for your bravery today," one said, shaking his hand firmly. The sun streamed through the high windows as people filed out, laughter echoing off the walls. James lingered in the room, taking in the faces of the people who had once seemed so distant. It felt as if the walls were no longer closing in on him, but rather expanding outward, inviting connections and collaborative spirit. He returned to the table, running his hand over its surface, feeling the warmth of the moment settle deep within him. Just hours before, he had been merely the cleaner and invisible cog in the corporate machine. But in that room, he had found his voice, and that voice had resonated. The realization of his power stirred within him, a quiet knowledge that he could affect change. This wasn't just the end of a meeting, it was only the beginning. As he left the conference room, a smile broke across his face, a feeling of accomplishment and purpose blooming within him. Suddenly, the office seemed alive, brimming with new possibilities. He envisioned a future where everyone was heard, where even the smallest voices had an undeniable impact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but James was ready. He would no longer stand in the shadows, waiting for someone else to speak for him. He had tasted the power of his own voice and felt the sheer force of that moment. With every step, he grew more confident. The world outside felt bright and full of promise. He realized that courage wasn't about grand gestures. It was about speaking your truth, no matter how daunting it seemed. James walked through the bustling office, but this time he was seen. No longer invisible, he was integral to the fabric of this place. He understood now that while numbers lay at the heart of business, it was the people who breathed life into it, and he would play his part actively. The conference table loomed large in his memory, a reminder of how one voice could ripple out and spark significant change. Today he cleaned that table, but he also polished a dream of culture where everyone felt valued and empowered to speak up. With every passing moment, he knew they could build a workplace filled with respect and collaboration. More than just a job, this was a community, a family, and he was proud to be part of it, ready to embrace whatever came next. James wiped the conference table with deliberate strokes, his heart racing as he glanced at the clock. The meeting was set to begin in 10 minutes, and the air crackled with tension. Outside the glass walls, he could see people bustling about, focused and efficient, while he, just the cleaning guy, filled a role everyone else took for granted. But today felt different. Deep in his gut, an uneasy feeling churned as he caught snippets of conversation about layoffs and budget cuts. He stepped back to inspect his work. The bright, polished surface gleamed under fluorescent lights, impressive, but what did it really mean? This was not just any meeting. The CFO was joining today, and everything hinged on her decisions. The weight of all this pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. The door swung open, and the executives entered, their expressions serious. James slipped into the background, invisible as always. They were clad in sharp suits and polished shoes, carrying laptops and briefing documents. The chatter grew louder, each word an insistent reminder that they were about to decide the fate of not just departments but individuals, the very people he had seen daily, struggling, laughing, and working hard. "Let's get this meeting started," said the CFO, her voice ringing with authority. Her presence commanded the room, making executives sit up a little straighter. James felt a quickening pulse of anxiety. He had heard stories about her cold and unyielding, the kind of leader who made the hard choices without flinching. The name alone sent shivers down his spine. As they settled in, laptops opening with the soft click of keys, the discussion began. Numbers flew around like bullets, each one landing heavy in James's chest. "We need a 15% reduction in costs," she said, her voice steady but sharp as glass. The room fell into a hush as if a storm had just rolled in. James gripped the cleaning cloth tightly, the fabric suddenly feeling like a lifeline. He thought of Sarah and Tom, colleagues who had families depending on their steady incomes. He could see their smiles and the resilience with which they faced each day. What would happen to them? Did the executives even think about the lives tied to this meeting? The CFO continued, listing departments targeted for cuts without a shred of emotion. "We need to streamline operations," she said. Her words echoed, bouncing off the walls while drilling into the pit of James's stomach. Every part of him screamed to speak up, but he felt small, a mere cleaner in a room of decision makers. The contrast was stark, the divide between them like a chasm. His heart raced and he found himself inching closer to the table, feeling the pull of the moment that begged for change. And then it happened. A gasp echoed through the room, loud and unmistakable. It was his voice he was speaking. The urgency in his tone surprised him as he stepped forward, uninvited yet driven by an impulse he could not ignore. Heads turned, the corporate atmosphere suddenly charged as silence blanketed the room. The CFO's sharp gaze fixed on him, a blend of surprise and annoyance hinted on her face. She asked, irritation creeping in. The grip of fear surged through him, but he fought it down. "I clean this room," he began, heart pounding in his chest. "And I hear what you say. Your decisions about cutting costs aren't just about the bottom line. They affect real people, like Sarah, who's a single mom, and Tom, who just started." A ripple of astonishment danced across the boardroom. The CFO narrowed her eyes, and behind her he could see the executives exchanging glances. They hadn't expected to be challenged, especially not by someone who mopped floors and emptied trash cans. "James, while I appreciate your concern," she replied, a hint of derision seeping through, "you need to understand that we are in a very tight position." He exclaimed, his voice steadying. Each word felt like a throw of the dice, but he was all in now. They have to be personal. Every figure in those spreadsheets represents a life, a family, and if you reduce staff without thinking it through, you're not just cutting budgets, you're tearing apart a community. The CFO blinked, an emotion flickering in her eyes for just a moment before she returned to her mask of professionalism. "That's a touching perspective, but this isn't about feelings. Facts don't tell the full story," James pressed on, his heart pounding as the room seemed to draw breath. "You want results. Invest in the people who make this company what it is, hoard fewer resources and squeeze out more benefits." There was a stillness, an electric pause as his words hung in the air like a spell. The often quiet CFO narrowed her eyes, clearly weighing his impact. For a second he thought he saw her retreat into thought, an acknowledgement of something deeper. "I know you're the cleaning guy," she said finally, her voice low. "I get that you care. Maybe it shouldn't be," James replied, feeling boldness bloom within him. "But if you want to grow, if you care at all, you need to start engaging with the people who actually keep this company running." James could feel the tension in the room shift. He could almost taste the uncertainty. How do you expect a company to thrive when its people fear for their jobs? A company isn't just a thing, it's a network of people working towards something. He could see a flicker of conflict in the executive's eyes, and he sensed that they were starting to reconsider the fabric of their discussions. The CFO straightened, a slight crack appearing in her polished exterior. "I won't deny the importance of morale," she said with a hint of warmth now. "We can balance reality with compassion," James shot back. "This doesn't have to be an either-or situation. Ada may say one thing, but the heart tells another. Investing in your employees now can save you far more in the long run." The room buzzed with a renewed energy. Murmurs began swirling around as the discussion shifted. One by one, board members started nodding, some even whispering agreements. This was surreal, the corporate landscape shifting before his very eyes. "We can create a program that brings employees into the conversation," someone suggested cautiously from the back. Another chimed in. Ideas began to flow like a river, washing away the rigid structure that had governed the room moments ago. James felt invincible, the pulse of energy vibrating through his veins. This was collaboration. This was change. The CFO leaned forward, studying James with newfound respect. "I appreciate your voice, James," she said, her tone softer now. "You've offered us a perspective we are often too busy to consider." For the first time, he wasn't just a cleaner, he had become an integral part of the dialogue. As the meeting progressed, conversations blossomed, reflecting a commitment to the employees that they all could invest in. The boardroom transformed from a place of sterile decisions to a hub of communal innovation. Each idea presented felt like a collective pulse, and James could see the executives leaning in, engaged in discussions they once took for granted. Solutions started taking shape, initiatives that prioritized employee relations and sought to foster a healthier work culture. At last, the meeting found its conclusion as the CFO turned to the group. "Thank you everyone for your insight today. James, thank you for your courage and your voice." Applause erupted, and James felt warmth fill the room. This wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who depended on each other in this workplace. He stood there in disbelief, realizing how far a single voice could reach. But as the applause faded, a sudden realization struck him. The CFO had recognized him, but would this moment last? Would changes actually come to fruition, or would it fade into the noise of corporate routine? As he pondered, he realized they still had to take action. Talk was cheap, it was the implementation that mattered. The executives filtered out one by one, many offering gratitude, while others still carried an air of unease. Once the last member left, silence enveloped the room, but the atmosphere felt charged with possibility. James lingered, replaying every moment. How had he transformed from being invisible to being a part of this? And yet, how much would it matter if the momentum didn't carry beyond this meeting? He finished cleaning the table, running his hand across its meticulously polished surface. The reflection caught his eye, a sea of shiny possibilities. But what would happen when the excitement wore off? Would they remember the urgency and weight of the conversation? Before he left, he took one last glance at the table, knowing that everything could pivot on the next decision they made. And what lurked around the corner? Would they return to their cold numbers or build a bridge out of the human stories behind those numbers? As he stepped out into the hallway, that uncertainty clung to him like a shadow. The air felt heavy with questions, the answers waiting just beyond reach. The world continued to buzz around him, but he knew that something fragile had shifted. James walked out, stalwart in his conviction, but wary of the suffocating reality beyond those walls. The challenge lay ahead. Could they collectively turn the tide, or would it crash back down upon them like a cruel wave, erasing every meaningful change they had just begun to carve? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows as he made his way back to his duties. And as he moved through the office, his heart beat with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Uncertainty loomed, but in that moment, James knew one thing for sure: he had sparked a fire. Whether it would burn bright or flicker out remained to be seen. And deep down, he understood that the road to real change could be long and arduous, but the journey had just begun.